All right, welcome to a tactical fly fisher quick tip here on the water. And I don't know if you can see from the backdrop today, but the wind is nice and strong, and we've been having to adjust a lot of things to be able to nymph in this type of weather today. You can see the surface of the water is nice and ruffled. It's been sustained winds, probably around 15 with gusts into the mid and high 20s. And in weather like that, Euro-Nymphing can definitely get pretty difficult. So here are 7 how can I got a phone in my hand. I can't make a 7 with a phone in my hand. But here are 7 tips for being able to Euro-Nymph in the wind. The first couple of tips have to do with making sure that your leader isn't catching as much wind. So how do you do that? Tip number 1, you're gonna make most of your drifts at a quartering upstream angle. Instead of making a drift straight across, making a quartering upstream cast, but fishing mainly perpendicular across from you, you're gonna focus, your drift is gonna end when it comes straight across from you, and you're gonna focus most of your drift upstream. So this means you're gonna have to be able to cast further upstream and manage your slack better, because you're gonna need to make long casts and then retrieve slack either with a hand twist or with a strip to be able to stay in contact with your leader as it comes back towards you. You don't get as long of a drift this way, it compresses it, but what that does is it makes your leader go at a quartering angle to the wind instead of a perpendicular angle, so it doesn't catch as much and get blown around. Tip number 2. This one is really built to make sure that you can keep your drift steady and smooth. A lot of times when it's gusty or the wind is buffeting your rod, you can make your drift and it's just kind of bouncing your rod tip around, and it's catching your rod as much as it is your leader. So when your rod's dancing like that, your sider's going everywhere, and it's tough to keep in contact and have a smooth drift. So a lot of times when I am fishing in windy conditions, I will make my cast, I will move the rod a little bit until I get it where it's comfortable, and then I will do all my slack removal or keeping in contact with the drift simply with my line hand. So I'll keep the rod in one place, retrieve my slack with my line hand, and then once it reaches, under the rod tip, I just fire and cast again. And there again, you're gonna fish a shorter drift this way, but it keeps the drift smooth and dead or natural. The last one that has to do with keeping your leader out of the wind more, or avoiding the effect of the wind on your leader, is to have your rod tip lower. Normally when I'm fishing, I might have my hand up here, at a slight shallow angle above my shoulder, and my rod tip's gonna stay in line with that. So my rod tip ends up eye level to a foot or 2 above. But when I have it that way, that exposes a lot of leader above the water. So a lot of it is exposed to the air, which means it's exposed to the wind. So when I'm fishing in windy conditions, I tend to keep my rod angle lower. So basically from my chest and below. I don't like that angle as much on a calm day because I'm not able to get the drift angles that I want to keep it as dead as I want and have as long a drift as I want. But in windy conditions, you got to make adjustments, and that's one of them. So keep your rod angle lower, somewhere between down near the water, like belly button height, to chest height. That'll help keep a little bit more of your leader out of the wind. Tip number 4, keep your sider just slightly under the water. Again, this is not one that I would use on a normal, less windy day, because your sider is thicker. Whether you have a wax sider or indicator mono, it's still thicker and it grabs water more than your tippet does. That's the whole point of fishing thin tippet, is to grab less water and get a better sink rate. But in this situation, when it's windy, you actually want that little bit of grab or anchor in the surface of the water. So when it's a windy day, I'll put my sider just an inch or 2 under the surface, and that'll help hold that leader to the top of the water so it doesn't blow all over the place in the wind. And then you can track your drift normally. Just remember that if you're not fishing on a windy day, it's usually best to keep your sider above water. Don't get in that habit just because of wind that you let it keep going below, because you're not going to control your drift that way, and you're also going to get extra drag from that faster water that's at the surface pulling your sider and thereby your tippet and your flies downstream. But there again, it's another adjustment that on a windy day is a necessary evil. Tip number 5, fish heavier flies. So a lot of times in calm conditions, I can get away with really quite light flies, especially on a micro leader, even in deep water. But when it gets windy, one of the ways you can compensate for that is to have a heavier fly. So go a bead size heavier on at least one of your flies, maybe even both. And that's gonna help get your flies to depth and then hold them there and keep them from being moved around. It's all about inertia, right? The heavier your flies are, the more inertia they have, the harder they resist movement. And so they resist being blown around by the wind more if you've got heavier flies. Plus, you need to compensate for the fact that you are getting uplift on your leader, which is going to lift your flies off the bottom when your leader is getting blown around, and those heavier flies will compensate for that and help still get you sink rate to get in the zone. Tip number 6 is kind of in line with the last tip. A lot of times we want flies with a quick sink rate if we really need to get down deep, so that's why we fish perdigons. In windy conditions, you generally want to do the opposite. Perdigons sink really quick, but if it's really blowing, they also will get lifted out of the water really quick, simply because they've got very little drag going both ways in the water, up or down. So in windy conditions, I like to fish flies that have a lot of volume and lots of materials that grab water. Flies like mops, rubber-legged stoneflies, or heavily hackled streamers or nymphs. Those flies take a lot more weight to be able to get them to depth because of that material that grabs water, but once they're there, they tend to stay there near the bottom, and that volume, that drag inherent in the materials keeps them near the bottom and doesn't allow them to lift off with the wind-blown current. So fish a mop, fish a rubber-legged stone, fish some soft hackles, and that'll keep your flies down near the bottom once they've reached the bottom. Tip number 7, when all else fails, go to a dry dropper. So sometimes it just is so windy that you really can't Euro-nymph. If it's getting blown around to a certain extent, there's only so much compensation you can make. So I will turn my Euro leader into a dry dropper, or if you're in a place where the water type suits it, you can also just go to an indicator rig. You know, there are limits to Euro-nymphing when it comes to wind. A lot of times you can get around it. I mean, we've had some pretty gusty winds yesterday and today, and we've still caught fish when we were Euro-nymphing, and I'm sure we will the rest of the day. But there is a limit. And when you reach that limit, whether of your own ability or your own frustration, then you may want to go to a suspension type rig, whether it's a dry dropper or an indicator, to be able to fish in that wind. And that'll help stick your rig in the surface and not get it blown around as much. So I hope you enjoyed these tips and that they help you out on the water. Remember your angle, your position of where you make your casts, the weight of your flies, the construction of your flies. All those things will affect how they drift, whether in or out of wind. So go through that thought process of how do I get my flies to the zone that I want and keep them there and not have them moving around unnaturally. And as long as you make those adjustments, you can usually catch fish in wind. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up here on the YouTube channel. Hit that little bell icon when you subscribe to the channel so that you get notifications when we post new videos. And come on over to tacticalflyfisher.com and we'll help you out with your fly tying and fly fishing gear needs. Thanks for watching.